At a little after 4 in the morning on June 22, 1944, the eastern horizon outside Vitebsk turned white. Not bright, white. For a few seconds, the men in the German rifle pits could see the flat ground in front of them as if daylight had arrived all at once. Then the sound reached them. It did not come as separate explosions. It came as one unbroken pressure, a wall of artillery so dense that conversation simply stopped. 6 days later, the German formation holding the city, the 53rd Army Corps, had ceased to exist. Its commander was a prisoner. 2 division commanders were prisoners. 2 more were dead or missing. By the end of July, German records would list the corps with 2 words: whereabouts unknown. The Soviet offensive destroyed it. But the trap had been built 5 weeks earlier, in a room far from the battlefield, when a city was turned into a fortified place, and a corps commander was stripped of the one decision that might have saved his men: the decision to leave. Vitebsk was an old river city in northern Belarus, built along the western Dvina where roads and rail lines from Smolensk ran toward the Baltic. German forces had taken it in July 1941 and held it for almost 3 years. By the summer of 1944, the front around the city no longer resembled a straight line. It bulged eastward into Soviet territory. Soviet formations pressed against it from the north, east, and south. On a map, Vitebsk looked like a hinge between 2 German army groups. Army Group North held the Baltic sector. Army Group Center held Belarus. The city sat at the seam. The 3rd Panzer Army, commanded by Colonel General Georg Hans Reinhardt, defended the sector. Inside the Vitebsk salient, General Friedrich Gollwitzer's 53rd Army Corps held the city and its approaches. Berlin believed the position could survive because it already had. The Red Army had launched 2 major offensives against Vitebsk during the winter of 1943-44. Both had failed. Soviet armies had attacked the shoulders of the salient, trying to cut the city off rather than batter directly through it. Both times, German defenses held. The numbers looked convincing. German records credited the first winter battle with more than 1,000 Soviet tanks disabled or destroyed. The second offensive involved over 436,000 Soviet troops. The attackers suffered more than 135,000 casualties, including over 27,000 dead or missing. Read alone, those figures appeared to prove that Vitebsk was a fortress. But there was another number in the same ledger. Before the February fighting, the 3rd Panzer Army counted only 19,150 infantrymen. During 15 days of battle, it suffered 11,688 combat casualties. More than half of its infantry strength was consumed holding the ground. The defense had worked, but it had worked like a machine burning its own engine for fuel. There was no replacement army waiting behind Vitebsk, no deep reserve of trained infantry, no armored force ready to counterattack once the next breach came. The salient had not demonstrated strength. It had survived by spending men Germany could not replace. Berlin drew the opposite lesson. On March 8, 1944, Hitler issued Order No. 11. It created a new category of defensive position: the fortified place. A fortified place was not merely a city prepared for defense. It was a city designated to be held regardless of what happened to the front around it. Each had a commandant personally responsible for its defense, a covering force and divisions assigned to fill the position. The theory was simple: deny the enemy a road or rail junction, force him to stop, tie down his troops, break the momentum of his advance. Army Group Center received 8 such positions, including Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Minsk, Bobruisk, Slutsk, Baranovichi, and Vilnius. Vitebsk was among the first. Gollwitzer became its commandant. In practice, the order changed the nature of his corps. A corps is supposed to maneuver. It gives ground when necessary, shifts divisions, preserves a route of retreat, and chooses the moment for a counterattack. Order No. 11 converted the 53rd Corps into a garrison. It could fight, it could die, it could not leave. The name 3rd Panzer Army suggested a force that no longer existed. By June 1944, Reinhardt had no panzer divisions under his command. His last mobile corps had been transferred away in 1943. Across all of Army Group Center's 490-mile front, only 495 tanks and assault guns were operational. The group's only substantial mobile reserve was an infantry division that had already lost much of its transport. The 53rd Corps itself held 4 divisions. 2 were regular army formations. The 206th Infantry Division had been raised in East Prussia in 1939. It was a foot and horse division, reduced to 2 grenadier regiments after years of fighting. Its commander, Lieutenant General Alfons Hitler, had received the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross only weeks before the Soviet offensive. The 246th Infantry Division had served around Vitebsk since 1942. It knew the ground, but familiarity did not make it mobile. It was another infantry formation with limited transport and limited anti-tank strength, led by Major General Klaus Müller-Bülow. The other two formations were the 4th and 6th Luftwaffe field divisions. They had begun as an institutional compromise. The German army needed infantry. The Luftwaffe had surplus ground personnel. Instead of transferring those men into army units, Hermann Goering formed his own field divisions under Air Force officers. The recruits were not necessarily poor soldiers. Many were fit, disciplined, and technically trained. But they had been prepared to service aircraft, manage signals, handle fuel, or support air operations, not to survive massed artillery and Soviet infantry assault tactics. Their original structure was light, weak in artillery, and intended for quiet defensive sectors. By late 1943, after repeated losses, the surviving Luftwaffe field divisions were transferred to Army control and reorganized. The 4th and 6th were rebuilt partly from the remains of other Luftwaffe formations already destroyed around Vitebsk. Half of Gallwitz's corps was therefore made up of former Air Force personnel, reorganized as infantry and reinforced with survivors from units that had already been consumed on the same battlefield. Their equipment told the same story. The 6th Luftwaffe Field Division's artillery included captured French heavy guns taken in 1940, and still in service 4 years later. Its anti-tank strength was limited. Its reconnaissance units had been improvised from remnants of several shattered formations. This was the force ordered to hold a salient surrounded on 3 sides, 2 understrength army divisions, 2 rebuilt Air Force divisions, almost no armor, and no permission to retreat. The offensive approaching them was Operation Bagration. The Soviet High Command committed roughly 1.67 million personnel, more than 32,000 guns and mortars, over 5,000 tanks and assault guns, and nearly 7,800 aircraft across the wider operation. Army Group Center had about 486,000 combat troops. At Vitebsk, 2 Soviet fronts were assigned to one design. Ivan Bagramyan's 1st Baltic Front would strike from the north and northwest. Ivan Chernyakovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front would strike from the east and south. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky coordinated the two. The plan did not require taking Vitebsk by frontal assault. It required breaking the shoulders of the salient and meeting behind it. The city would then become its own prison. German intelligence detected much of the Soviet buildup, but it missed one of the most important formations, the 6th Guards Army assembling against the northern shoulder. It also failed to identify the full scale of the Soviet strategic reserves. On June 19, Army Group Center reported that Soviet air strength opposite its front had risen to roughly 4,500 aircraft. The command warned that this did not fit the High Command's assumption that the main summer offensive would fall elsewhere. The warning changed nothing. That same day, Soviet partisans began a coordinated assault on the German rear. Explosive charges went under railway tracks. Telephone lines were cut. Repair crews cleared many demolitions. They did not clear enough. The Germans had spent years preparing defensive belts in Belarus, multiple trench lines, minefields, bunkers, and firing positions. But fortifications only work if the formations inside them can still react when the enemy breaks through somewhere else. At Vitebsk, reaction had already been forbidden. The bombardment opened on June 22. North of the city, the Soviet 43rd Army smashed into the German 9th Corps and drove toward the western Dvina. German units fell back across the river and destroyed bridges behind them. South of Vitebsk, the 3rd Belarusian Front struck the German 6th Corps. The Soviet 5th Army found a weak junction between German divisions and forced a breakthrough. The breaches widened by the hour. By June 24, the gap south of Vitebsk was about 25 miles wide. Soviet mobile formations were moving through it. The rear of the 53rd Corps was exposed. Then the last road out was cut. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commander of Army Group Center, asked permission to abandon Vitebsk and pull the 3rd Panzer Army southwest to a prepared position. The request was refused. Busch telephoned personally that evening. It was refused again. Only after the encirclement was nearly complete did a compromise arrive. Gallwitzer could withdraw 3 divisions, but 1 division had to remain inside the fortified place. The 206th Infantry Division was selected to stay. The order was militarily irrational. Once the roads were cut, the 3 withdrawing divisions would have to pass through Soviet forces while the 4th remained behind to be destroyed. Berlin even proposed parachuting a staff officer into the city to ensure Gallwitzer understood that the 206th was not to leave. Reinhardt stopped that order by telling his superiors that if anyone had to be dropped into Vitebsk, he would go himself. The staff officer was not sent. The hold order remained. On June 25, the 3rd Panzer Army began to disintegrate across its front, To the north, 9 Corps retreated toward Polotsk. To the south, 6 Corps lost contact with neighboring formations and was transferred to another army because Reinhardt's headquarters could no longer control it. Behind Vitebsk, the Soviet 43rd Army moved down from the north while Ivan Ludnikov's 39th Army drove up from the south. They met west of the city. The ring closed. Gollwitzer had already tried to force an exit. He pulled the 4th Luftwaffe Field Division out of the line and sent it southwest as the spearhead of a breakout. The 246th Infantry Division was ordered to hold the Dvina crossings open behind it. Neither mission succeeded. The 4th Luftwaffe Field Division was cut off and destroyed on the evening of June 25. Its commander, Lieutenant General Robert Pistorius, disappeared with it. The 246th Division's counterattack was caught in the open. Soviet ground attack aircraft tore into its columns, vehicles, and gun teams. By June 26, Gollwitzer faced the decision that Order No. 11 had been designed to prevent him from making. Obey Berlin and let one division die in Vitebsk, or disobey and try to save the Corps. He chose the Corps. Gollwitzer ordered every remaining formation to break out together. Heavy weapons, vehicles, supply wagons, and much of the artillery were abandoned because they could not move through the forests and roadblocks fast enough. The men went west on foot. They reached the first Soviet blocking positions outside the city and stopped. The 246th Infantry Division and the 6th Luftwaffe Field Division were encircled again along the withdrawal route. Soviet infantry fought into central Vitebsk. By evening, Gollwitzer ordered the last garrison units to abandon the city in direct defiance of the High Command. Vitebsk fell. The final breakout began before dawn on June 27. The survivors were trying to cross ground the Red Army now controlled for roughly 50 miles. They had little heavy equipment, broken communications, wounded men in the columns, and no organized force coming from the west to meet them. The attempt produced the last signal ever received from the 53rd Army Corps. Between 28,000 and 30,000 German troops had been caught in the pocket. About 10,000 became prisoners. A small number reached German lines. Most did not. One group of several thousand escaped the immediate encirclement and moved west through the forests. Soviet units intercepted it near the lakes and destroyed it over the next 2 days. The command structure vanished with the formations. Robert Pistorius of the 4th Luftwaffe Field Division was lost on June 25. Rudolf Peschel of the 6th Luftwaffe Field Division was lost during or immediately after the final breakout. Klaus Müller-Below of the 246th Infantry Division was captured. Alfons Hitter of the 206th Infantry Division was captured. Friedrich Gollwitzer, commander of the Corps and commandant of the fortified place, was captured. A Corps commander and 4 divisional commanders removed in less than a week. The 53rd was not the only headquarters erased during Bagration. Army Group Center lost 5 Corps headquarters outright. The 12th, 27th, 35th, 41st, and 53rd were destroyed as functioning commands. The 206th Infantry Division was formally struck from the German order of battle on July 18, and in the unit records at the end of that month, the 53rd Army Corps was simply listed as missing. The fortified place doctrine had promised to slow the Soviet advance by forcing the enemy to fight for key cities. At Vitebsk, it did the opposite. Because 4 divisions were pinned inside the salient, they could not be used to rebuild the line outside it. Because the neighboring 6th Corps collapsed at the same time, a wide opening appeared north of the German 4th Army. Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army drove into that opening. Its forward elements reached the Berezina River on June 28. The northern arm of the encirclement that would trap much of the German 4th Army west of Minsk passed through ground the 53rd Corps had defended only days earlier. The fortified place did not become an obstacle in the Soviet path. It became the breach through which the exploitation force advanced. The men responsible for the order did not share the fate of the men who obeyed it. Busch, who had asked to withdraw and been refused, was removed from command on June 28 and replaced by Walter Model. Reinhardt retained command of the 3rd Panzer Army through the retreat and later received command of Army Group Center. Gollwitzer went into Soviet captivity. On July 17, he was marched through Moscow with other captured German generals. He remained a prisoner until 1955. Hitler was also captured and later joined the National Committee for a Free Germany while in Soviet hands. A new 53rd Army Corps was raised in November 1944 from a different headquarters and different troops. It fought in the West and surrendered to American forces in April 1945. It carried the same number. Nothing else was the same. Vitebsk had survived for almost 3 years because its defenders still possessed the basic freedom every infantry force needs. The freedom to trade space for time, to bend a line before it breaks, and to move before a position becomes a grave. In June 1944, that freedom was removed. The Red Army did not have to storm Vitebsk. It broke the shoulders of the salient, joined hands behind the city, and let a written order hold the door shut.